For any island nation, the sea is everything. It's their highway, it's their connection to the world, it's a total lifeline. But for a country like Japan, that connection is on a whole other level. So let's dive into the story of how this maritime giant found itself staring down a huge crisis.
I mean, just look at this. The numbers are kind of mind-blowing. We're talking over 99%. Let that sink in. Over 99% of all of Japan's imports and exports travel by sea. That's the cars, the food, the energy. Almost everything that keeps the country running depends entirely on its fleet of ships.
Right. So that brings us to the big question Japan had to face right around the turn of the century. Because this vital artery of global trade, well, it was starting to show some really serious signs of strain. And the thing is, it wasn't just one problem. It was basically a perfect storm. On one side, Japan's shipping industry was up against absolutely ferocious competition from its neighbors. And on the other, a much, much deeper crisis was brewing right at home. They were running out of people to actually work on the ships.
Okay, now what's so interesting here is that at first glance, things don't look all that bad for Japan. That's the red line. Their fleet did grow, which is good. But then you look over at their biggest competitor, South Korea, in beige. They weren't just growing, they were exploding. Japan was pretty much being left in their wake.
So how fast was South Korea growing in that same 10-year stretch? 128%. That is the kind of massive growth that doesn't just put a little pressure on you, it completely changes the entire game. But as scary as that competitive gap was, the real existential threat wasn't about the ships themselves. It was about the people, the actual human beings you need to sail them. And wow, this chart just lays it all out there. Look, working at sea was getting less popular across the board. Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, they all saw a drop in the number of seafarers. But Japan's decline, again, that red line, it wasn't a drop, it was a straight-up cliff. A 45% drop. Think about that. In just a decade, Japan lost almost half of its seafarers. This wasn't just a little worker shortage. The entire profession was being hollowed out. A whole generation of maritime know-how was at risk of disappearing. Clearly, the government had to step in. So, faced with a fleet that was getting outpaced and a workforce that was literally vanishing, the Japanese government decided it couldn't just sit on the sidelines. They put together a massive rescue plan to try and turn the whole industry around. And their strategy had a few key parts. They launched a new ship registry. They relaxed the crewing rules so you didn't need a full Japanese crew. They offered some serious financial aid for building new ships. And, this is the big one, they brought in a totally new tax system. Yeah, this last one, the tonnage tax, was a real game changer. See, Japanese companies were getting hammered by high operating costs and taxes compared to their rivals. So by taxing them based on the size of their ships instead of their profits, the government made their tax bills way lower and more predictable. It finally let them compete on a more level playing field with fleets in Europe and Korea. And as the source material itself says, this wasn't some minor policy tweak. These were serious issues that forced the government to fundamentally change its laws. That just tells you how high the stakes really were. Okay, so that's the plan. A huge government effort to save a critical industry. But here's the billion-dollar question, right? After all that, did it actually work? Well, the results, you could call it a very mixed report card. On the one hand, yeah, the policies helped. Japan's fleet grew by 16% and its tonnage went up 28%. Not bad. But then look at South Korea. Their fleet grew 128% and their tonnage by a jaw-dropping 164%. And then you get to the people problem. Japan's number of seamen still plunged by 45%. So what it all boils down to is this. The government's plan was pretty good at creating incentives to build more ships. But money and taxes can't solve a deeper human problem. They couldn't build a new generation of sailors. And this chart, wow, this chart says it all without using a single word. It's an age pyramid of Japanese sailors. You see that huge bulge up top? That's all the older, experienced crew members. But look down at the bottom, where the young people, the next generation, should be. It's practically empty. It is a demographic time bomb, ticking away at the heart of the industry. And that leaves us with this final, really important question. Japan proved it could write policies to keep its fleet modern and competitive. But that still leaves its biggest challenge totally unsolved. Who exactly is going to sail those ships into the future?